So I'm absolutely delighted and honored to be joined today by film producer, author, educator, and activist Judy Richardson. Among her many accomplishments and projects, Ms. Richardson was a producer on the award-winning documentaries Eyes on the Prize and Malcolm X Make It Plain. Before that, she was a staff member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, the organization at the vanguard of the civil rights struggle in the 1960s. And today we're going to talk about her experiences with SNCC. Welcome, Judy Richardson.
Thank you, Adam. I'm so happy to be here and to be in the VCU community.
Yeah, it's really great to have you here. So to get started, can you talk about how you first got involved in activism work?
Yeah, and I guess I have to go back just a little bit to who I was when I come into SNCC. I had grown up in Tarrytown, New York, which is like about 45 minutes north of New York City. And when I was growing up there, yeah, it was a commuter little town in Westchester County, but it was also a factory town. And so my father, as did the fathers of all the people I knew, worked in the plant, and it was the Chevrolet plant that made parts for Chevrolet cars. So my father had been an organizer, actually, of the local once he started working there. So the union local, the United Auto Workers local there. And in fact, he was treasurer of that local when he died of a heart attack on the assembly line when I was 7 years old. So my mother becomes a single parent and a working parent at that point. And somehow manages to get my sister to college at Bennington, managed to get me to college at Swarthmore College in Pennsylvania on a full 4-year scholarship, because my mother had no money. And so that's my entree into what becomes SNCC. So I go down, it's my freshman year, and I'm looking to see what I can get into. My mother's not there to stop me, So I'm going to meetings, I'm seeing what's happening. And I happen to go to this one meeting that seems to be talking about sit-ins, and I go there and I find out that it's a meeting of I later find out to be the Students for a Democratic Society, otherwise known as SDS. And that's the national group of liberal, progressive, primarily white students all around the country at lots of colleges who are very supportive of the student sit-in movement of the 1960s. And so I happen to go to this meeting. I find out that they're working on a number of things, social justice issues. For example, they're working with the local Black organizations, local Black organizers in Chester, Pennsylvania nearby, which was totally segregated. All public facilities in Chester, Pennsylvania were segregated. So they're working with the local community there. And then they're doing a few other things, but they're also joining bus rides of college students that are going down to Cambridge, Maryland, on the Eastern Shore of Maryland, which is at that point still is about 2 hours away from Cambridge. And so I just go on, no major commitment, is just cause my mother's not there to stop me, right? So I go down and I get on the bus and I get there and I find out that there are like segregated facilities, right? That there are people telling me I can't come through the doors of some really nasty places, So I had known racism, in Tarrytown, anywhere, but it was hidden, it just meant, well, you couldn't get a house on the other side of Broadway, or you weren't going to go to so-and-so's party, or you could, it was big things and little things, but it wasn't so overt that you weren't going to be allowed to go into a restaurant. So the main thing that I remember is like this moment when I'm in a line. It's a protest, and we're trying, and so I'm on the line of local and college students who are in this line trying to get into this local bar and grill called the Chop Tank Inn, because Cambridge is on the Chop Tank River. And so I'm trying to get in, and I'm looking into this place, and it's like, it's nasty, it's dirty, it smells of stale cigarettes and rot gut liquor. And there's a moment where I'm thinking, why do I want to even get in here? I don't even know why the people who are in there want to be there, But there's a point where I say, but wait a minute. And there was this big burly white guy who's telling me I can't come through the doors, right? So it's like, wait a minute, you're telling me I can't come into this nasty little place, right? So it wasn't so much that any of us wanted to be in some of these places. It was, you don't get to tell me in a public place that I'm not going to be able to walk through these doors, you know. So then at a certain point, I start getting arrested and being in jail, and sometimes it's over the weekend, and I'm late for class on Monday. And, you know, I mean, Swartho is this kind of elite Quaker college. And so it's like my grades, you know, are starting to get a little funny. And so at some point, Penny Patch, a young white woman from New Jersey, had been a sophomore, and she had taken part of her sophomore year off from Swarthmore to work in SNCC's project in Southwest Georgia. And Penny comes back, and she comes to my dorm room, and she says, you know, Judy, you've been going so much on these demonstrations, and why don't you just take off that the next semester, which would have been the first semester of my sophomore year? She says, why don't you just take it off? You know, of course, you're going to make sure that you can still get your full 4-year scholarship, you know, which I did. But she said, you know, take it off and then you can come back. The other thing that Penny says is you have to apply, because the point was I was coming from the North. So it wasn't like I was a Black person coming from a Southern project that where people knew me already. They didn't know me. So I was going to have to apply. And what Penny says is, but if you apply, these are exact words, you got to go by Ruby Doris. Now, Ruby Doris was the strong, amazing young Black student from Spelman College, who was now the administrator of the SNCC National Office in Atlanta. Ruby Doris had done 30 days jail, no bail, in Rock Hill, South Carolina. She had done, as part of local demonstrations there, she had done 45 days in the dreaded Parchman prison when she was on the Freedom Rides. Wow. And she was just this amazing woman, and she was absolutely focused. And so Penny is now telling me, if you want to take off, you know, the next semester, you got to go by this woman because she is fierce. Okay. And she had been part of the Atlanta student movement and had been part of one of the founding conferences at SNCC. So I go ahead and do that. But then I have to think about my mother, right? Now, my mother had an 8th grade education, played a mean jazz piano, but also read everything. You know, I mean, I remember sitting there looking at Meet the Press on every Sunday. She read the you know, New York Post when it was a real paper. I mean, it was all of that. She was in the world, right? And so I have to tell her now that, you know, she never went to college. She had an 8th grade education. That I am now thinking about taking off a semester at Swarthmore. Okay, so I finally screw up the courage to do this. Now, nobody had cell phones, right? So I'm going to the dorm room, to the dorm hallway, the hallway in my dorm, to go to the payphone, to put my dime in, to call my mother. And I talk to her and I say, you know, this is what I'm doing. And don't worry, I'm going to retain the 4-year scholarship. Everything's fine. I promise I'm coming back, you know, and she's fine. So I'm thinking, whoa, I didn't have to worry all this time. I hang up, I go back to the room. Not more than 20 minutes later, I get this call from my older sister, the one who had been at Bennington, now is at Columbia Records. And she doesn't even say, hi, this is Karita. She's just screaming on the phone, right? She says, what do you think you're doing? You can't take off. What did it? She's 9 years older than me, right? And I finally said, no, really, don't worry. It's just going to be 6 months. I swear, I have talked to the dean, all is well. I retained the scholarship. Everything's fine. And she calmed down. Now, I will say, as always happened with movement families, my sister then leaves Columbia and starts working for the New York SNCC office and is helping to organize the Harry Belafonte concerts during the 1964. My mother is writing these gorgeous letters, because she was really wonderful on letter writing, to the Tarrytown Daily News, to some of these racist white people in Tarrytown. And so it's like, you know, you bring the family in. That's what always happens. So I take off, you know, I go ahead, I finish out the freshman year. And then after I do my summer job in the summer, and then I go down where I had been working in Cambridge, Maryland. Gloria Richardson, her family kind of owned the drugstore and they owned the funeral parlor. Black people knew the Gloria Richardson's family. Her uncle had been for years on the city council because Black folks had the vote in Cambridge, Maryland. They just couldn't do anything with it, because all the power was still with the white powers that be. And in fact, Gloria, in our Hands on the Freedom Plow anthology, talks about her uncle, who at every December during the Christmas party, the city council, of which he was a member, they would have their annual dinner, Christmas dinner, but he couldn't go. Now, he was a city councilman, but he couldn't go. And so he would sit there, and the city council would send his dinner to his home. And Gloria remembered that she said her aunt was just livid, that he was even accepting this dinner. But what he understood was there were things at that time that he could do as a city councilman that he couldn't have done outside. So in any event, this is the Gloria Richardson, who is the main visible person in the Cambridge, Maryland movement, and it was called CNAC, the Cambridge Nonviolent Action Committee. Now, the nonviolent part, that was not Gloria, but she understood it, as did many SNCC people and local movement people. They understood it as a tactic. Right. So it was the power, the powers that be, they've got all the guns, right? They've got everything. And so if you want to, for example, get Black people to be able to do this or this and this without getting them killed, then you are going to have to, you can use nonviolence as a tactic to get what you need and to keep people together and to not get so many Black people killed. Gloria said, my daughter told me, Ma, you can't come on the demonstrations because, as her daughter said, you're going to kick somebody. Okay. Now, so Gloria on the demonstration, she would act right? She would be fine. But she says, even in the Hands on the Freedom Plow piece, she says, but once that picket line was over, all bets were off. She said, because I knew these boys. She knew these little white boys who were spitting on them and throwing things at them. They used to come into her drugstore, right? So it's like her thing was, I will do this when I'm on the picket line, but once that's over, okay. So when I come into this, that's the first time I see an organization, first of all, that is led by a woman like Gloria, who is 90 some years old. I mean, I know she's over 95. I'm still scared of her, right? This was my first entree into the movement.
I'm just listening to your story is how, how central you being a student is to that, is to your story, and your mom not being there to tell you no. But that experience of you leaving college for a little bit to go down south to do work is one that is reproduced over and over again in the civil rights movement. And the role, it makes me think about the role of young people and students in mobilizing during this period.
Yeah, I mean, just to know how SNCC is formed it tells you a lot. I mean, it is, and I will mention Miss Baker here, and then I'll go into the student organizing. But Miss Baker, Miss Ella Baker, who is the political mentor, she was our guiding light. And Miss Baker in 1960 is on the staff of Dr. King's organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, Black ministers. And so she's the administrator. She's basically the executive director, temporary. And she goes to Dr. King, then Reverend King, and says, we need to bring all these young people together. And so she gets $700 some from SCLC, Dr. King's organization, and she contacts people because she has this network. She had been director of branches for the NAACP. She had been working organizing milk co-ops in Harlem in the 1940s. She knows local grassroots leadership, not just the top rung, but the local leadership. And so when she sends out the notices to these local students, a lot of them go to people whom they trust, like Chuck McDew, who's the first chairman of SNCC, is at South Carolina State, an HBCU in Orangeburg, South Carolina. And he says, I got this leaflet, and yeah, it had Reverend King's name on it, but it also had Ella Baker. And I didn't know Miss Baker. So he said, I went to my pastor in Orangeburg, South Carolina, and I said, who is Miss Baker? And this pastor said, whatever Miss Baker tells you to do, you do. Because this pastor, as were many other local Black leaders, were part of Miss Baker's network. And so what she does is she brings them all together at her alma mater, another HBCU, Black college, Shaw University in Raleigh, North Carolina. And so who comes in? Diane Nash and Marion Barry and John Lewis and Bernard Lafayette. They come in from Nashville. Julian Bond, who later becomes chair of the NAA. Julian Bond and Lonnie King, they come in from the Atlanta student movement. Ruby Doris Robinson, her sister comes in from Spelman. All of these colleges are coming in, brought there really by Miss Baker. And what folks remember is what Miss Baker talked about in her keynote to all of these folks gathered. It also included, by the way, a few white students from like Vanderbilt who were supporting the movement. And so she says to them, you know, what you're going for has to be about more than just a hamburger. So, and she's talking even then about economic equity. That it's not just that you want to be able to sit down and order a hamburger. You need to have the money to pay for it, and to have the power, the economic power, to be able to start your own, you know, sit-in, own restaurants. She's always talking about economic equity. So she brings all of these young people together. So when I come into the national office, what I see are people who look like me, are my age, and they are changing the world as I know it, right? So I'm looking at, I come in and I see Julian Bond, he's typing with two fingers, got the cigarette hanging out his mouth, and he's the communications director. I see John Lewis, who is over, and he might have been, you know, working in the workroom because everybody did everything. I see Jim Foreman, big, the executive secretary who really pulled a lot of this together. I see there's a workroom next door, and that's where the printing press was. No, that was in the basement. The research department, Jack Minnis, who could get research from A. Stone and had the Congressional Quarterly and all of these, because we had to research. You always wanted to know, you could get from Jack before you went into a town. Certainly you talked to local people about what you were about to meet, but also in terms of who controlled the town from farther up, not just the local Chamber of Commerce and the White Citizens Council, but who controlled it beyond that. That was Jack, and that was our head of research. Again, older white guy, new research. And so he could, you know, he would look through and he'd say, well, so-and-so corporation really controls it. In Danville, it was Dan River Mills. It was so-and-so. You always knew where the money, you know, that whole thing about follow the money. Well, we knew about that back then. So, that's what I see when I come into this. And I see it's like fury of activity, you know, and you also see people singing. They'll be singing freedom songs, you know. They're talking to the field on what was called the Watts line, wide area telephone service, like an 800 line, because you had to keep in touch with all the projects in Mississippi, Alabama, Southwest Georgia, Arkansas. And they would call in twice a day. And just to say, this is what happened. This is some, you know, so-and-so shot into so-and-so's home, shot into this church. So-and-so got fired because they tried to register to vote. All of that we are then putting in a weekly newsletter called the Student Voice. And that Student Voice is being organized and written by Julian Bond, who comes out of the Atlanta student movement. And he had been in the newspaper business. He had been with the newspaper. So all these are the folks who are my age. I'm at that point 19 years old.